Hi, I'm CJ, and today we're going to use liquid polymer clay to do an inlay on wood. Let's go to the work table.
Okay, so the first thing I did was grab this block of wood that I picked up at the art supply store, and every woodworker's favorite part of a project, sanding. So we're just going to sand this one until it's nice and smooth. I started with a pretty rough sanding sponge here. I picked these up at the hardware store. Really nice. They're soft, so they're easy to get around some contours on these blocks on the edges here. And I'm just going to knock down the corners here to make sure it's nice and smooth and get rid of any sharp corners. So after getting everything with that low grit sanding sponge, moved on to this one here. It's a 220 grit sanding sponge to make sure I got everything nice and smooth and soft. Cleaning up the top nice and smooth before we start marking it out and getting our design on the piece. Alright, so next we're going to mark out the art that we're going to use to try this inlay technique with liquid polymer clay. I'm just going to mark off the center of this block here so I have a nice place to start off doing this design. The design I chose for this was from the Player's Handbook of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. It's the symbol for the god Lathander. For those of you who don't know, Lathander is a god in Dungeons & Dragons lore. He is a god of light and radiance, and he is a big part of our campaign over on Tabletop Bob's channel, where our group of adventurers recently lost an adventurer, but was replaced by a Cleric of Lathander. So here I'm just marking off the circles that make up the symbol. The symbol is described in the Player's Handbook as a road rising up to meet the sunrise. So here I'm just marking out the sun for the sunrise and the rays that are emanating from the sun as it rises over the horizon. And next we're just going to work on the horizon here. We're just going to mark off a line and fill that in so that we have a nice space for where the sunrise comes up from. I'm just going to color everything in here with the pencil to make sure I have everything marked off and I know where I'm going to be removing the wood when I get to the carving stage of this project. Okay, and the final part of this symbol of Lathander here, the road rising up to meet the sunrise. Just going to mark off 2 lines on the bottom here so that they come and meet up with the sunrise at the top. And then just going around to fill in the outer ring of the symbol, making sure it's all colored in so I know where I'm going to be carving, getting everything nice and marked out. And with everything marked out, we're just going to go in and make sure everything's nice and filled in evenly, and we're going to make some rounded edges here. The symbol in the Player's Handbook for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition kind of has these rounded corners around the edges of these lines here. Kind of makes it more organic and gives it a little bit more of a handmade appeal to it. So we're just going to give these a little bit of a roundness to them before we start carving. And with everything filled in and clean, we're going to grab our tools. So grab our wood carving tools here. We're going to start with this one. It's a little knife, and we're just going to go around and we're going to trace the outside edges of everything that we're going to carve, so that when we go and carve into the wood, we're going to be able to stop right at the edges where we want. We don't want to cut any further. So it's going to be nice and keep our lines nice and clean as we carve them out of the wood. Okay, and then once we've got everything nice and carved through, we're going to grab our little gouging tools here and we're going to start carving away at the wood. Now, this is really important to be very careful during this step. These tools are incredibly sharp, so always keep your hands behind the tools and always cut away from yourself. Never towards yourself, and make sure your hands are out of the line of where you're going to be cutting from, because these tools can slip and you can gouge yourself pretty good. So just make sure that you're taking your time, making sure you know where your hands are, making sure that you're using nice even pressure and keeping everything nice and safe. Cutting away from yourself and keeping your hands behind the tools. And here's an important technique to also remember, is that it's a lot easier to cut with the grain of the wood as you're trying to carve into these than it is to carve against the grain. So right there I'm just carving with the grain to try and get a nice clean line, and I'm going back in again and carving the line that I'm going to carve. So here I skipped ahead a little bit, and you can see I'm just finishing up the last of the little carving. It's not a very deep carve that I'm doing. Maybe it's about 1 to 2 millimeters into the surface of the wood. We just want to have enough space where the liquid polymer clay is going to kind of sit in there, and then we can smooth it out evenly. We don't want to have too deep of a pour, because that can also cause the liquid polymer clay to not set firmly in the cooking process. You know, you bake this clay in an oven, and you want to make sure that you don't have it too thick in areas where it might not bake and harden completely. So here I'm just finishing up, making sure to, again, keep my hands behind the knife, and just finding that it's a lot easier, again, to cut with the grain. So I'm turning the piece around to make sure that all of my cuts are with the grain of the wood before moving on. And we've got it nice and carved out, and we're just going to go and grab our liquid polymer clay here. I had silver and gold, but I started with just using the gold, and we're going to go and set the oven at 275 before we start doing anything, and make sure it's on. And then we're just going to go and kind of squeeze out some of the liquid polymer clay here, and we're just going to try and fill in the carving as best we can. Just kind of squeezing some clay in there, and then I tried using a wooden popsicle stick here to try and help fill in as much of the carving as I could, and it was working out okay, but then I started seeing it spilling out over onto the regular wood, so then I kind of just decided to, just start squeegeeing it all over the entire piece of wood to try and really get it into the carving, to really get it in the inlay. And then grabbing some extra to fill in any areas that were missed or didn't get enough liquid polymer clay in there, and squeegeeing it around, making sure it is nice coverage and we're filling it in all the way to the edge of the wood, making sure we get a good amount of coverage inside the inlay in the carved area. Giving it a final squeegee to try and knock down all of the clay, and then into the oven it goes for 15 minutes to let it bake. Tick, tick, tick. And here we go, taking it out. So I was pretty nervous when I pulled this out of the oven. A lot of the clay had formed little mounds and bubbles all over the surface of the wood, so I was a little nervous that it was gonna affect the overall look of it, so I grabbed the sanding sponges again and just started trying to knock down the clay as best I could to try and get everything nice and even and in line with the top of the wood block. And then the clay that had oozed out over the edges of the inlay had kind of created a thin film, and that was a little bit easier to kind of knock off of the wood and get away, because we really wanted to make sure that we had a difference between the wood and the polymer clay layers. So here I kind of got most everything knocked down, and I'm just going to hit it again with the sanding sponge to try and knock down as much of the high spots as possible. And it was a little bit harder to see than it was on camera, the difference between the wood and the gold. On camera it actually comes out pretty nice, but in person it didn't look as great, so really wanted to make sure it popped. But I'm just continuing to sand here and make sure that I get as much of the polymer clay off. So once I got done sanding there, I tried using this little chisel to try and carve away some of the clay. I thought it would be a little bit easier to get some of these really big spots where the clay had really stuck out over the surface. This was a little bit of a mistake later on where I kind of gouged into the wood also. This was a pretty good piece I pulled out right there. But later on I did make a mistake and gouge into the wood a little bit more than I wanted to. Another technique I could have tried would have been to use a hobby knife to try and carve away at the high spots on the clay here. And I think that would have been a little bit more effective than using this small chisel to try and cut away at the clay as it was on the surface of the block. You can see that gouge I just put in there, and then right back to sanding to try and knock down all of the high spots that were left over and really even out and smooth the top of the surface of the block of wood. And with that all done, got it nice and smooth, knocked off any of the extra dust, and we're just going to hit it with this dark walnut stain here to try and really make sure everything pops right off the surface. So here I'm just kind of adding the stain. The great thing about the polymer clay is because it's a polymer clay and it's not very porous, the oil-based stain here is just going to kind of sit on the surface and wipe away nice and clean, and we're not really going to worry about it getting into the clay. So here you can see I'm just adding the stain over everything, not really worrying about trying to avoid getting it on the polymer clay because it's not going to affect it at all. You should have probably had gloves on here. If you're going to do this, make sure you wear gloves. And then here I'm just wiping it away, and you can see some of the little bubbles and stuff kind of got some of the stain in there, but the polymer clay is just nice and clean as you wipe away all of the extra stain from the surface of the wood. And I'm going to go in and do another coat of the stain to try and get it a little bit darker. I wanted to make sure that there was a nice contrast between the gold polymer clay and the dark stained wood. And here's a really good view of how the stain just kind of wipes right off of the polymer clay. Didn't affect it at all, and we just wiped off all of the stain to make sure that it was nice and stained. And to finish it off, I just hit it with a little bit of this butcher block wax and oil mix to seal the wood after letting the stain dry on the wood. Just wipe that on, give it a couple minutes to sit, and then come back with another cloth napkin here and just wiping off any of the excess of the oil and wax combo.
That's how I made this inlaid art using liquid polymer clay. Leave a comment below if you have any tips on how I can improve my technique, and I may try them out in a follow-up video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, be sure to hit the bell button and get notifications on all my upcoming videos. There are links in the description to my other social media where you can follow me. There's a lot of things you can do, and this is what CJ does.